I mean, at a certain point, it was a marriage of convenience. Russia needed munitions, it needed manpower. On the other hand, there's strategic dimensions of this that are harder to ignore. And in that case, again, Kim's going to get a lot more than he's going to get out of Donald Trump. Maybe at that point, Donald Trump says, oh, and by the way, Vladimir, one of the things I expect of you is to keep this guy under control. And that may be kind of a new Cold War II-like model.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. An iconic image from Trump's first presidency is his meeting with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Trump famously said that the pair fell in love, but since then North Korea has advanced their missile program and cozied up with Russia. So how will Trump approach North Korea in his second presidency? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr Edward Howell, International Relations Lecturer at the University of Oxford, specialising in North Korea. Plus, I'm also joined by Sydney Seiler, former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the US National Intelligence Council, and now Senior Advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So, as you can tell, I am in good hands here to discuss this subject today. Thank you both for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Sid, you were working as the US Forces Korea Senior Analyst and Senior Defense Intelligence Expert for North Korea during Trump's first presidency. Looking back to that time, from the outside, we saw these huge Twitter spats, threats of potentially pressing nuclear buttons, and then things all drastically changed because Trump said they fell in love and they met 3 times. And obviously, things did evolve since then. But how would you describe that period of time between Trump and Kim? And on what terms did they leave things on?
You know, it was a fascinating period. I had gone out to Korea in 2016, right after serving as a special envoy for six-party talks. When some 8 years after the last round, I finally figured out there would be no talks. But that put me on the ground in Korea for the Missile a Month madness that 2016 and 2017 represented, as Kim Jong-un really moved his focus from occasional bouts of dialogue and expanding his fissile material production capability to actually proving a credible delivery mechanism. And we would watch these missile launches often in the morning, waking us up, dragging us into the office, figuring out what was going to happen, what North Korea's ultimate goal was, particularly as it marched gradually to the point of demonstrating an ICBM in late 2017 that could range the entirety of the United States. And at that time, I was asked, what did I think would be the most dangerous course of action for North Korea? And my response was a pivot to diplomacy. Because finally, after years of struggling with China in particular and Russia to a lesser degree, we finally got some serious sanctions in response to what we had seen in 2016, 2017. In the middle of all this, Donald Trump comes along. And Donald Trump, unorthodox in a way that brought a new dimension to this issue. It showed leadership engagement on it. That didn't mean that President Obama or George Bush before him or Bill Clinton before him didn't have attention to this issue, but Donald Trump was willing to engage rhetorically in a way that we'd never seen, meeting North Korea on its level. Your button, you've got a button, my button's bigger than your button. I'll bring the full fire and fury. And, meanwhile, I'm on the peninsula in a job that's responsible for providing early warning if North Korea is getting ready to enter into some type of conflict or attack. And while we saw this advancement of the missile program, there was never any indication that we were actually headed down the path of some type of conflict. But for reasons probably, I would say, mostly internal to Kim Jong-un, he had planned to culminate his research and development cycle at a certain point and then pivot to diplomacy again to mitigate pressure, seek short-term concessions. And then at the end of 12 to 18 months, we had predicted pivot away from talks and back into nefarious activities. And that's essentially what he did. In the middle of that, of course, we had the diplomacy largely facilitated by South Korea. And I think that's an important departure. I often ask myself, would we ever have seen a meeting in Singapore if it had not been for the active advocacy and mediation of President Moon Jae-in and his National Security Office Director Chung Eui-yong, who went to Pyongyang in March of 2018 and came back with a message that Kim was open to talks. And Donald Trump, when given the opportunity, said, why not? And that's how we ended up in Singapore. Singapore produced a document where, yes, you can say the two leaders committed to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but in a broad sense, it's not any commitment by Kim Jong-un to denuclearize. And the president knew that. He's a deal maker. He knows when he's locked in a concession or locked in a move, and he knew he had not done that, even though the public face of this was now the two leaders have agreed to denuclearize. A year passed by, and then they meet in Hanoi. And what happened in Hanoi was similar to what happened when we first had this shift from this focus on this plutonium program, very limited, very visible, to concerns about a clandestine, covert, highly enriched uranium program. We confronted the North Koreans the first time back in 2002, and ever since that point, they've refused to acknowledge anything outside of Yongbyon, and that has been the obstacle that prevented progress under the agreed framework, under the six-party talks, under the Obama administration's Leap Day understanding, and ultimately why Hanoi failed. Because Kim Jong-un showed up at Hanoi unwilling to demonstrate any flexibility and not intending to negotiate anything beyond what he had been willing to put on the table in the past. And so Donald Trump absorbs all of this. We have another year before the talks finally completely break down in 2019. And then COVID introduces a mystery. Is North Korea's refusal to the United States a new posture, which they articulated in a major party meeting, or was this simply a temporary stand down because of COVID? Well, I think Joe Biden got the answer to that when all the approaches during the Biden years were rejected. And here we are today. And, the big question on the table is, will Kim change his mind and finally engage the United States? And I think Donald Trump so far has demonstrated a willingness to talk. That's not surprising. A positive portrayal of his relationship with Kim Jong-un, even though a lot of the facts might point in a different direction. That's not surprising. Donald Trump is seeking to maneuver Kim Jong-un back to the table, to restart a process that may or may not lead anywhere, but at least it shows he's actively trying and creatively exerting effort in the domain. And if Kim Jong-un decides to respond, he will. If he won't, we might have another year or 2 or 4 years even with a standoff that the Biden administration met.
And as we've discussed, a lot has changed since Trump and Kim met in 2019 to shake hands. And Trump has said that he wants to reach out to the North Korean leader following his return to the White House. Edward, how do you expect this conversation to go, and what do you expect to be discussed?
I think we've got to remember that this is not just Donald Trump 2.0, this is Kim Jong-un 3.0. Both leaders will have had a clear experience of Singapore and of the inconclusive end to the Hanoi summit. The two leaders didn't even have lunch right at Hanoi. And I think this relationship that we're seeing between Pyongyang and Moscow puts the US in a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, for sure, if Trump reaches out to Kim and Kim feels like he wants to reciprocate, I can envisage a scenario in which the two leaders meet. There's a lot of optics. They sign some kind of broad, ambiguous commitment, as Sid mentioned. The 2018 summit in Singapore, the wording was not the denuclearization of North Korea. It was the commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which both sides interpreted in different ways. And I think, on the other hand, however, we must remember that two things. Firstly, now, Kim Jong-un has Russia. He's not only been sending artillery, he's not only been sending ballistic missiles, he's been sending troops, around about 11,000. And irrespective of the fact that, in my view, this isn't going to change Putin's strategy, the relationship between the Cold War client and the Cold War patron has been revived. So we could potentially see Kim Jong-un meet Trump, but on the basis that actually he doesn't need the US as much as he did in 2018, 2019. I think, on the other hand, we could also envisage a situation in which Kim Jong-un thinks, quite plausibly, I don't need the US. I've got Russia. But why don't I need the US? Because Hanoi taught me that actually, if I want to negotiate with the US, I need to come back with something tangible. And in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of attention to Trump's statement hours after his inauguration of using the word nuclear power to refer to Kim Jong-un. People are saying that actually does this undo the decades-long US policy of not giving North Korea what it wants, which is de facto recognition as a nuclear armed state. We then have Trump saying on Fox News that he's willing to reach out to Kim Jong-un again. But only a few days ago, the North Korean state media demonstrated photographs of Kim Jong-un visiting a uranium enrichment site. So I think we've got to remember that the context has changed. 2025 is not 2017 or 2018. What does Kim Jong-un ultimately want? He wants North Korea to be recognized as a de facto nuclear armed state. And since 2021, when he announced a 5-year defense plan of unconventional and conventional weapons, from reconnaissance satellites to drones to solid fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles, he has been slowly going down that shopping list, testing and revealing these new weapons. So perhaps, on the other hand, he may wish to push the can down the road a little bit and make the US wait. Fundamentally, I think North Korea's overall strategy is what I call strategic delinquency, behaving badly in order to reap rewards.
And it's an interesting point about Trump describing North Korea as a nuclear power. I mean, South Korea said that North Korea can never be recognized as a nuclear armed state. And some suggest that potentially this could set up an arms race, including possible development of nuclear weapons in South Korea, Japan. Would you say that's plausible? Do you think that could potentially happen?
I think on that point, we've got to remember that when we have all of these discussions about whether South Korea is going to go nuclear, there's a big discrepancy between the views of the South Korean public and South Korean elites. I think that the discussion of South Korea getting nuclear weapons, an independent nuclear deterrent, really has never been on the table. I think it's been floated around. I think that actually the South Koreans will be very concerned, actually, of the potential of an arms race. There's obviously the counter-argument that, well, okay, South Korea may face sanctions. This is in violation of its commitments to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it would never use this nuclear deterrent. But I think that this would be a step too far, at least now.
Going back to North Korea's involvement in supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine, he's put out that he wants to have talks with Putin to try and create this ceasefire deal. Sid, how do you think that a potential ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia could potentially influence North Korea's relations with the US?
Well, that's a great question, and the unknown at this point. It would be largely driven by the degree of cooperation and the depth of what type of agreement might be had between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Essentially, I would imagine that Trump would seek to secure from Putin some agreement to send the North Korean troops home, and maybe even curtail cooperation and support to the DPRK in exchange for some type of U.S. concession, perhaps some sanctions relief to entice North Korea back to the table. I thought it was interesting that Secretary of State Rubio mentioned, among other things, also using the nuclear power terminology, also noting that sanctions had failed to halt the program. For those who defend sanctions, we usually say the sanctions help stigmatize, they help impede, they help moderate the quality and quantity of the program, etc. But if you say sanctions have failed, then suddenly you have an opportunity to do some goodwill gesture, maybe of some type of sanctions relief tied to a bigger Russia-U.S. deal that Moscow, in its own way, kind of shows it's willing to partner with the U.S. in bringing Kim back to the table. But these are all like best case scenarios, right? At this time, even the ability for Trump to come to some agreement with Putin on Russia, that Vladimir Putin would so quickly throw Kim Jong-un under the table. The past several years have been favorable for advocates of an alternative world order, right? Call it the axis of autocrats, axis of upheaval, what have you, that, the Western-led world order and its restrictions and its rules and its sanctions are all coming under challenge, under the lead of actions by, of course, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, to a lesser extent, Tehran and Pyongyang. Putin would be making a more strategic concession than merely halting the hostilities in Ukraine to essentially throw Kim Jong-un under the bus. So I think there's a strategic, this is a debate among experts right now. And Edward, I'd love to hear your opinion. Was it, at a certain point, it was a marriage of convenience. Russia needed munitions, it needed manpower. On the other hand, there's strategic dimensions of this that are harder to ignore. And in that case, again, Kim's going to get a lot more than he's going to get out of Donald Trump. Maybe at that point, Donald Trump says, "Oh, and by the way, Vladimir, one of the things I expect of you is to keep this guy under control." And that may be kind of a new Cold War II-like model. And we all know how that works, because even during Cold War I, and Edward is an expert on this, well, Beijing's and Moscow's leverage over Pyongyang during the period from 1953 up to the 90s, it ebbed and flowed, and it was never definitive. And so it's going to be tough to get Moscow to be a real good partner on Pyongyang in any meaningful way.
Edward, would you like to respond to that?
I think that the foundations of the Moscow-Pyongyang rapprochement were indeed transactional. As Sid has just mentioned, the need for artillery initially, then it became missiles, now it's become all of that plus manpower. But I think layered on top of that transactional foundation is a strategic and also ideological element. I think we all know that Russia and North Korea, let's add China in there as well, they don't all have the same interests. But what they do share is a clear and concerted opposition to the US, to the US's allies, particularly in Northeast Asia, and the US-led international order. I think what's important to bear in mind is that, in my view, even if the Ukraine war were to end rather suddenly in the short term, the relationship between Russia and North Korea would change. Moscow would not need the troops, but it would still be there. It would not look the same, but the relationship would still be there. I think when Putin and Kim Jong-un signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty on the 19th of June last year, the final article of the treaty makes clear that the treaty is intended to last indefinitely. We know that historically, the Soviet Union and North Korea have had treaties, and the treaty that was signed in 1961, Yeltsin basically pulled out from and abrogated from in 1996. So I'm not saying anything is set in stone. But the confluence of all of the changing geopolitical factors at the moment, a weakened UN Security Council plays into the favor of Russia, China, and North Korea. This ideological opposition towards the US, but also Russia's need for replenishing of artillery and manpower, means that actually, even if the Ukraine war were to end, I think this relationship would still be there in some way, shape, or form. Why? Because fundamentally, we're at a stage where if North Korea conducts a seventh nuclear test, which we've all been waiting for several years, tomorrow, for instance, the UN Security Council would not be able to issue a statement of condemnation, a unified statement of condemnation. Forget sanctions. We're long past that. And on the point of sanctions, Sid mentioned the importance of sanctions. I think in 2019, when the Hanoi summit failed, we saw North Korea's then Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho make a statement and say, well, actually, we didn't want all sanctions to be removed. We only wanted specific sanctions imposed in 2016 and 2017, the more stringent ones, to be removed.
The ones that work.
Right, exactly. That's the point. If we say that sanctions don't work at all, why would the North Koreans have asked that?
How do we expect Trump to approach Kim this time round? Last time we saw Trump approach it in this friendship. He said they fell in love, and some mention that Kim likes to have that respect for North Korea as being seen as this power, this global power. And while last time when Trump and Kim met, their meetings did not result in the goals that they were aiming for North Korea, on the other hand, potentially that approach, that friendship, that respect helped to gain some leverage there. This time round, seeing that a lot has changed since then, do we see Trump having a plan to rekindle that relationship, or is he going to take a tougher approach?
I remember early in my career when a senior official told me, Sid, it's very easy to come to a deal with North Korea. It's hard to come to a good deal. And this is what we continue to face today. And so, all evidence points in, as Edward mentioned earlier, the strategic end state goal of North Korea, which is to lock in its nuclear weapons state status or nuclear power status, not to infringe upon the NPT, and to get the world to deal with it, with the nuclear issue off the table. And that has not happened so far. It's been a point of frustration for Kim in regards to China. He certainly sees both United States and South Korea as unwilling to do that. But there's one person who has accepted him just the way he is, and that's Vladimir Putin. And so there's a natural affinity. I think that a shared worldview. I love Edward's use of ideological because it seems to be seen as many people as anathema in the post-Cold War period, but this is an ideological issue at a certain level. And there's a natural partner in Russia. Kim's looking holistically. What do I get out of the United States, and what could I get out of Donald Trump, and what risk would be involved? And I think the fact that, in particular, the strong language in saying there's going to be no more dialogue with South Korea about unification, demonstrated a real concern that even under the best circumstances, an improved, North-South relationship is ontologically and existentially threatening to North Korea. So, the personal relationship, the love letters, the ability to stand in front of a mic and say good things about your counterpart, even if you don't always believe them, will only take you so far. In the history of summits where leaders meet when all these issues haven't been resolved at a lower level, you have some good photo shoots, you have some psychological relief that finally the leaders seem to be sitting down and creating new paths forward. But at the end of the day, there's no enduring value. There's nothing enduring that came out of Singapore. There's nothing enduring that came out of Hanoi. And, I remind everybody that North Korea had every opportunity to pick up the pieces after Hanoi. It was similar to the 2012 when I was at the White House, North Korea's abrogation of the Leap Day understanding with the long-range missile launch. They had another 5 years with Barack Obama. They just didn't want a deal. And so, I don't think everybody should, as Edward stated so eloquently, you don't simply rewind and return to 2019. This is not 2018. This is not 2019. So I'm less optimistic. I think the intentions of the Trump administration will be there. I question the intentions of Kim Jong-un.
And Edward, would you like to answer that as well?
I think we need to make a distinction between interpersonal relations and interstate relations. And the reason I say this is actually because the North Koreans have made this distinction. Around about July last year, when Trump gave a speech in one of his rallies, and he said, "I'll invite Kim Jong-un to a New York Yankees game." The North Koreans responded and said, "Oh, in the first Trump administration, it was good that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump got on as people, but the interstate relations didn't improve." And Pyongyang's viewpoint in last July, which is the same as it is now, is that fundamentally North Korea's worldview towards the US as this hostile power with a hostile policy that will never be nice to it will not change. Add to that the changing context from 2018 and 2019. You've got a North Korea which is testing missiles that may land in Japan's exclusive economic zone or even a little bit outside of it. But the missiles that Pyongyang has hitherto been launching are flying higher, faster, and further, little by little. Okay, but you don't develop a nuclear and missile program overnight. I also think that there's also a possibility that Trump and Kim do meet, and as Sid said, we have all of the optics, we have all of the theatrics. And North Korea might say, like Kim Jong-un said in 2018, before the two leaders met in Singapore, "I'll put a moratorium on my long-range missile tests. I'll put a moratorium on my nuclear tests. We've achieved the status of a responsible nuclear state. We don't need to do any more tests." And then what does Pyongyang do after Hanoi fails, after the working level talks in Stockholm fail in October 2019? It suddenly says, okay, we're back to testing. The moratorium is now no longer valid. So I can envisage a situation in which the two leaders meet, but North Korea doesn't actually stop. its development of its nuclear and missile program. This is what the regime calls the treasured sword. And there's also immense domestic audience value. This is enshrined within the North Korean sort of domestic propaganda. Whether or not the people believe it, that's a whole other question. And I think and Kim Jong-un will be thinking, well, what can I do to get something without actually giving up this vital component?
I think it's worth noting, if I may, North Korea's R&D cycle over the last 3 decades has allowed it to take periods of stand down and launches and testing that, strategically speaking, in the longer run, have little, if any, impact on the nuclear program or the missile program. They have the political advantage of bringing us through months or years without a launch or without a test. And there's some good to be had from that, but that doesn't really mean that the program itself is being significantly impacted by the moratoria that we've had over the years. So the question will be, what is the moratorium worth? For example, if it looked like North Korea was getting ready for a 7th nuclear test, and suddenly the idea of a kind of unilateral proclamation of some sanctions lifting and an offer to talk in exchange for North Korea refraining from missile launches and nuclear tests, kind of the status quo ante going back to what we had at the time of Hanoi, that may be of sufficient interest to Kim Jong-un to explore what he would have done anyway, right? Maybe stand down from testing, stand down from launching. So that would be within the realm of the possible. But, as that deal appeared in Hanoi, and the reason why we turned it down but offered to talk more about it was, in and of itself, it was insufficient to really credibly say that the program is being contained in any way.
This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I feel like we could sit here for hours continuing this discussion, but unfortunately we're going to have to end it there. Dr. Edward Howell, Sid Seiler, thank you both so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you.
Thank you.